Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Huw Crompton. He's professor of musculoskeletal biology at the University of Liverpool in the Institute for Aging and Chronic Disease. He has developed the Fossil Footprint Archive jointly with Matthew Bennett of Bournemouth University. So, Dr. Crompton, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the evolution of our musculoskeletal system, I guess. So first of all, can we get insights into the evolution of our locomotion and other aspects of our musculoskeletal system by studying closely related species?
Yes. Up to a point. It was actually Charles Darwin who said a long time ago that yes, you can do that, but you can get information from our past from close related species, but you can't assume that any species that we are related to would have been the same when we split as it is now, and that's one of the major. That's been a major issue, one of the major problems in reconstructing the origins of human bipedalism.
Right, but to understand the evolution of human bipedalism, do we have to go back to our last common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos?
Further than that.
Oh, further. Okay, so
Yeah. So that's the point. And this is what I've been kind of working on, and what the fossil that I'll be able to show you later has taught us quite definitively now. Can I just talk a little bit about this?
Sure, of course.
One thing that happened is that in about the 1960s, when people started were first looking at genetics, and they came up with the information that our closest relatives are the chimpanzees and bonobos. That rather set people off on the wrong foot, because chimpanzees and bonobos are pretty terrestrial animals, and they have already started moving around on the ground and moving around in open country, and quite a few people therefore assumed that looking at a chimpanzee will tell you a lot about how we came to be bipedal. Now, this is not what people before had thought. So there's been in the 60s, there's like a reversal of views concerning the origins of walking. In the 1930s and even earlier than that, people fairly logically to me assumed that our style of locomotion, bipedal walking, had origins in the trees, not on the ground. Now, this information about close genetic relationship with chimpanzees, and together with ignoring Darwin's advice, led people off in the wrong direction, in my view. And so people started to think that we must have been evolved from a knuckle walking animal like the chimpanzees and the bonobos. Now, this has increasingly been shown not to be the case, and certainly if you look at the fossil record, that does fairly emphatically say that it's not the case. So that we now have had to have a major rethink of where we came from, when we started to become bipedal, and what was the processes surrounding that.
And do we know that? Do we know when exactly we started becoming bipedal?
We don't know exactly. It's the interesting thing is that if you go a long way back in the fossil record, a long way, to the first apes of any kind, at around 19 to 20 million years, they were already orthograde, that is, that they had upright body posture, and they were almost certainly arboreal. They were almost certainly tree-living animals. There's one called Morotopithecus, and then there are some actually in later in Spain, but they may not be closely related to ourselves. So it's quite a long way back. When we first became bipedal, that's a different question, and that's much later.
Right, but bipedalism only comes after we become terrestrial animals, or not?
No, it doesn't, and that's
Okay.
what my fossil which I'm about to show you tells us, and that's what's so fascinating about her. Would you like to see her bits of her?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Okay, well, this is a skull, which is going to help us an awful lot. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes.
She's called Littlefoot. She is 3.6 million years old. She's a female, quite an old female, comes from Sterkfontein in South Africa. So this is one of the oldest close relatives of humans that we have. Okay, so the skull doesn't tell you an awful lot about the way she moved, except so far as we can look at the neck region and what we can learn from diet, which I think we're going to talk about a bit later. Can I show you some other bits?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Right, so this is her shoulder blade and her upper arm, and the first bit of her forearm, and this is her hand. Whoops, can't see that one. That's her hand.
Yeah.
We have about 93% of the skeleton, so that's far more than we have for anything until about 1.5 million years ago, and our own genus. Now, this genus is Australopithecus. It's not Homo. So at 1.5 million years ago, we have a Narikotomi skeleton, which is a youth, but a member of one of the first members of our own genus, Homo. She is an Australopithecus. Okay, so if you look in detail at the shape of her shoulder blade, of her scapula, and of the arm bones, we can be pretty sure that these were being used quite a lot for climbing, or at least for moving in the trees. They don't seem to be very different from those of other great apes, or the ancestors of living great apes. So that's one thing. So we have a rather conservative arboreal, that is tree-living upper limb. But here's the surprise. We have a lower limb. So this is the lower part of her thigh bone, the femur. We have on the other side, we have the upper part. Now what's interesting, if we look at the knee joint, the shape of the knee joint is pretty much just like our own. So the two sides of the knee are asymmetric, so that the medial side is longer and more curved than the lateral side, which is flatter.
Right.
Now this drives what's called locking of the knee, which we have, and it's what enables us to stand upright without using much muscular effort. And she has this. She also has the little a well-developed muscle that we have called popliteus, which unlocks the knee if you want to start walking again. So this lower limb looks very much like the limb of an animal which walks about on the ground. This upper limb looks very much like an animal which climbs around in the trees. Right. So together, the answer seems to be that we became upright walking animals before we ever left the trees, which is really quite neat. She, most likely, would have been walking around on the ground quite a reasonable amount, but was still using the trees to access food quite considerably, because her upper limb was still very adaptive for climbing around in the trees. It doesn't necessarily mean that she climbed, for example, like a chimpanzee does or a gorilla does or a gibbon does. What I rather think is that she was bipedal also in the trees, but because if you're moving around on a branch, it's difficult to balance. You make your life an awful lot easier if you simply reach out and touch something lightly. If you're standing upright, that gives you quite a very strong leverage about the foot, just by a very small touch of the hand. And I call this hand-assisted bipedalism. Orangutans do it. Gorillas do it. We don't know that chimpanzees do it. It's simply, it may be a matter that people haven't looked hard enough, but I kind of think people looked enough at chimpanzees to think maybe that's right, that they don't do it. So it seems very likely that that is how we became bipedal, that we started to be upright in the trees. We did some climbing, yes, but we became upright because we were becoming larger. For a quadrupedal animal, if you get much beyond 30 kilograms, the forces which are tending to rotate the body off the branch start to get unmanageable. There really aren't that many monkeys, for example, which can manage to sustain arboreality at that sort of body size. So it looks like as we became larger, it became increasingly difficult to be quadrupedal animals. And so we started to make use of increasingly of upright body posture, supported by the hands and occasionally doing some climbing. It's important to remember that people who live in the West, people who live in Europe, people who live in America, are not the only human beings in the world. And there are still indigenous human populations which substantially climb to get their food. And there are some, for example, in the Congo, the Twa people. There are some in the Philippines. There are some in northern Malaysia. And they are quite often small, relatively short people, but they are otherwise totally like ourselves. But the muscles tend to adapt in a different sort of way during development to enable them to climb better. So climbing and moving around in the trees is part of what we as humans do. It's just in the West we don't do it very much. Now we could in the future if things get really bad and all civilized culture collapses because of who knows what of climate change. Maybe we'll go back to doing that, and there's nothing really to stop us doing that. To go back to being partially. I'm not saying seriously that will happen, but it is possible. It's still within our kind of biological remit, what we're adapted to do. And that I find kind of fascinating. And this lady's got an awful lot to do with it. There are other fossils which about the same time or a bit earlier, which tell a somewhat similar story. There's a fossil called Ardipithecus ramidus that lived maybe 0.7 million years, 0.7 million years earlier than she did. Slightly older than she did. There's a fossil called Ardipithecus animensis, that is the same genus but a different species. And there's evidence that they were somewhat similar, but we have very little of their skeleton, so we can't be as certain about the biology as we can with Littlefoot, because we have so much of it. We have 93% of the skeleton. That's 3 times more. I'm sure people have heard of Lucy. That's 3 times more than we have as we have of Lucy. So there was a long argument after Lucy was discovered in the early 1970s. People couldn't make head or tail of her skeleton but because some people said, oh, that she had just that the adaptations they appeared to have for climbing were anachronisms. Other people said no, they must have been part of her normal locomotion, and because she was adapted like that, she must have walked around in a bent knee posture. In other words, with the knee like that, and all kind of stooped. Now, I spent quite a lot of my career demonstrating that's really not a very good idea, because the forces around the knee, if you try and do that, are so big because of gravity that it is really very energetically expensive, and it's just highly unlikely. And there's no need, because you can see from her knee that her knee was adapted for standing upright and perfectly capable of walking bipedally. Maybe not as far as Homo later. There are different good reasons for that. One is that the limb lengths were actually quite conservative. She had relatively short legs compared to ourselves. You don't have the limb elongation, which is typical of our genus, Homo. That hadn't started yet. There are other reasons. One thing, oddly enough, is related to her brain and the perfusion of blood into her brain. We've got, amongst all the other things we've got, we've actually got the first neck bone, and that's got the little holes that the vertebral arteries use to get into the supply the blood to the brain, and they are really small in diameter compared to ours. So she had poor blood perfusion. So probably a control of walking upright was not brilliant, and it probably was quite tiring for her to do so. And also her semicircular canals, which are in there and help us balance, they are more like an arboreal animal than they are like a terrestrial animal. They weren't well suited for moving around on the ground. They were well suited for climbing around in the trees. Mm-hmm. So, there is good evidence that she had started to move around on the ground at the same time as she remained substantially an arboreal animal. She did both. At what time things went from being totally arboreal to starting to be bipedal at all, we just don't know. We don't have fossils from that time, and we don't know when that time is. So that's a question still to be answered. But we know that 3.6 million years, 6-7 million years ago, which is the data of Littlefoot, and that's only not very much younger than the separation of chimpanzees and humans, which is 5 to 8 million years ago, that she had already become in terms of her lower limb, a committed biped. Absolutely had become that. Whereas chimpanzees are quadrupeds.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Go on.
So let me just ask you, you showed to the camera several different fossils and told, sort of the story we already know, or at least the bits we know. So how can we learn about muscles from bone remains? Because muscles, because it's a soft tissue, doesn't fossilize, right?
Right. So, yes, we have to look at the areas of muscle insertion and origin, right? So where they come from, where they end up, and in terms of the upper limb, the scapula, you can say, although there's some distortion in this, but this has now been corrected by computer, so we can look at the size of the muscles which help to abduct her arm. We can look at the size of the muscles which help to pull the arm into the body. We have markings on the muscles, markings on the bones where the muscles insert. So what we can do these days is actually to use a computer, and this is one thing I'm doing at the present moment, and actually to simulate the power of muscles if you attach them to the right place on a bone, what the forces would have been that they could have exerted. So that's a very new technique, which is becoming, I think it's got a long way to go, a lot of good prospects for the future. One of the key things for us really, and talking about bipedalism, is the pelvis. This is quite diagnostic of how bipedalism is working. Our pelvis is quite short from top to bottom. If you compare it to a chimpanzee's or an orangutan, so here it is, and so this part is quite deformed and distorted from when she fell and when she died, but this part is not bad at all. And the upper part above that's the hip joint. So the upper part, which is called the ossa nominatum, the ilium, in a chimpanzee would have been long like that, from top to bottom. Hers is short, ours is short. And that means that the muscles of the buttock, the gluteal muscles, had a large area of origin. So they were powerful. So they were like our own. So that's one thing we can say. Now, if you look at a chimpanzee or a orangutan, they would have had a very long ossa nominatum from top to bottom. And that gives a different kind of leverage about the hip joint, which is better for a quadruped, but not very good for a biped. So that's something we can say. What I have to come to now is which of the great apes appears to be most like ourselves. And it's not the chimpanzee, it's the gorilla. And that may be surprising to a lot of people because of our almost obsession with the chimpanzee. Now, in my mind, genetically, yes, we are closely related to chimpanzees, but that doesn't mean that chimpanzees at the time of separation were like chimpanzees today.
Right.
So they have become perhaps more specialized, moved further away from their ancestral condition than we have. So we are quite conservative. Gorillas are probably even more conservative. Gorillas have that sort of shape of pelvis. So they have a short pelvis. So they have powerful gluteal muscles, muscles of the buttock. So which means that they are really quite effective in extended postures of the hip joint, which we have to have for being bipedal. So in a quadruped, your relationship is like that, and you're moving the hind limb around like that. In a biped, it's like that. And having muscles like so, which are powerful towards the end of extension when you're walking, is very important. And gorilla has that. Now, to what extent that is not necessarily because gorillas spend a lot of time being bipedal, but they spend a lot of time being orthograde and or upright, having an upright body posture. So what I'm doing at the present moment by computer simulation is actually taking a muscle origins and insertions from a gorilla and applying them to Littlefoot's pelvis and looking the forces they would exert about the hip and comparing that to those of a human musculature and seeing which fit better. Because 3.67 million years ago, she wouldn't have had muscles exactly like ourselves, of course not. So we want to see which is closer to what extent her musculature may have been more like that of a gorilla. Of course, gorillas have moved on as well, but they seem to have moved on later. And really, that shouldn't be surprising to us. This has been said since about 1933 by a man called Adolf Schulz, who he ran the Anthropology Institute in Zurich and they had a huge collection of primate bones and did an awful lot of measurements. And he noticed that the closest foot to human was that of gorilla. So and we've done some computer modeling already, which shows that the forces in standing and the forces in walking in the gorilla foot are actually very close to human, as he would have predicted. And he also pointed out that the pelvis is the same, that the gorilla pelvis is the closest to that of a human. So it looks like the common ancestor of chimpanzees, gorillas, so chimpanzees and ourselves, and chimpanzees and gorillas, was more gorilla-like than it was chimpanzee-like. And chimpanzees have gone off in their own direction, becoming more quadrupedal. That perhaps has an answer to, maybe to answer to us. We're not very much different. Obviously, we split from them. They're getting more competition as the tree-dwelling animals. So maybe that's why they've become really good quadrupeds. They're really fast as a quadruped, and become increasingly a terrestrial quadruped. So they've probably evolved more in many respects than we have, apart from up here. We are obviously an awful lot cleverer than poor Littlefoot, who had the brains size was pretty much the same as a chimpanzee, had a brain which was, in terms of its organization, was like a chimpanzee's or gorillas. It wasn't like ourselves. So the skeleton, in terms of the bipedal-like skeleton, was much more similar than the brain was.
Mm-hmm. So let me just see if I get this right. So we have a last common ancestor with chimpanzees, but before that we have one with gorillas. So
yes.
And so the last common ancestor between us and chimpanzees, you are saying, would be more gorilla-like than chimpanzee-like,
yes.
Correct?
So in the postcranial skeleton, I'm not saying anything about the skull, because that's not my expertise, but as far as the limb bones are concerned, yes, absolutely. And of course, it's not, you can't just look, gorillas have been evolving too. They were faced with competition from ourselves, and then faced with competition from chimpanzees. We don't know quite what the gorilla does and has kept on doing for the last few million years, which enable them to survive. They're obviously doing something which we can't do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. So they're using the forest a little bit less, a little bit different than we would have been doing. Something like that. So yes, yeah. Otherwise, you're right. The common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans was more gorilla-like than chimpanzee-like, and and then if you want to have the common ancestor of chimpanzees, humans, and gorillas, again, it would have been relatively gorilla-like.
Mm-hmm. So apart from these bone remains that we have, is it possible also for us to study a little bit more and better how our locomotion worked by looking into the kinds of environments we evolved in?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Now, one of my ex-students and one of my ex-collaborators, we had a student lined up to go and find exactly that sort of answer. She was going to go to the Congo and actually compare the human people who live there, the Twa, who are tree users and live in the same forest as gorilla, and to see, and that would have been a wonderful thing, because we can compare how humans and gorillas use the same trees. Now, of course, she wasn't a human, but that's the best we can get, the closest we can get. And that would have taught us a lot, but unfortunately COVID happened, and a war happened, so we can't do that yet, but that has to be done, and that's vital. And no one has done that yet. We did do quite a lot of work on orangutans some years ago, and that's where the original idea for hand-assisted bipedality came from looking at orangutans who do all sorts of things. They are very diverse in terms of their locomotion. Of course, they don't. They are not so closely related to us by a long chalk. They separated off much earlier. But that's where the original idea came from. And yes, the right thing to do would be to go and try and work out exactly what's the difference between how human tree climbers use trees and how gorillas use trees. We can get a little, and are still trying to do so, by looking at, for example, Western humans who climb a lot. And people who parkour athletes. That's what I was trying to. Do you know that term, parkour?
Yes.
Yes. So parkour athletes are one model we've actually used in a laboratory, and actually looking at the how they would move through a simulated arboreal environment, and the differences between one individual and another have told us quite a bit about, for example, arm use and what differences are more important, give you more effective movement in our simulated arboreal environment. So we've been able to do that. We were hoping to do more with tree climbers who do, Western tree climbers who are arborealists, the arboriculturalists, for example, and people who do it for a living. But yes, we need more field work. Really need more field work. But I say in the present environment, we can't get it done. It's a great pity.
Mm-hmm. But do we know what were the kinds of selective pressures that operated on us and led us from, an arboreal species to a terrestrial one? And did it have something to do with the fact that the environments we lived in changed in a way that forced us out of trees?
Yes, or at least pushed us in that sort of a direction. Mm-hmm. All this that we're talking about happened something in the period between 15 million and 5 million years ago. During that time, there was increasing breakup of forests, which wasn't always permanent. Sometimes the environment would change, the climate would fluctuate a bit, and things would go back to being forested, and then they would start to open up again. And the forest became increasingly broken. We do know that. So yes, that animals which had randomly developed things which happened to be useful for being more terrestrial or more bipedal would be better able to survive that environmental change. So it's driven by environmental change upon random genetic variation. So we're constantly, our genotype is constantly changing randomly, and sometimes things happen which in a slightly different environment might be useful, and they are selected for increasingly. That seems to be the way that things happen. So yes, it was environment driven. It was particularly the case in Africa, in East Africa in particular. There was quite a lot of desiccation of the environment. Orangutans seem to have, if you like, given up on trying to be terrestrial, and they are still more or less always canopy dwelling. I've been out, spent a lot of time in Borneo, and they do occasionally come down to the ground, but not often. Not like gorillas, not like chimpanzees. So they are really kind of stuck in what primary tropical rainforest exists. Gorillas and chimpanzees changed, and we changed very substantially. Yes, so it was environment driven on the basis of random genetic change.
Mm-hmm. But it has also something to do with diet, or not?
It has something to do with diet in a different sort of way. If I can get little bit again. Unfortunately, we can't. The jaw is still attached to the skull, and we can't get a very good look at her teeth. We can see enough of her teeth to see that the wear was rather strange and unusual, and it looks like she was somewhat like as the case in orangutans. She was either stripping bark or eating thick-skinned fruit. Mm-hmm. So we can learn a little bit about her diet. There are things that she could have eaten on the ground, but maybe not that many of them. But yes, eventually there would be a change towards using more resources on the ground, and that would have further driven increased terrestriality. We do know for some rather fancy work which has been done with the synchrotron in Britain, in southern England, we can actually look at the microhistology of her teeth. And during her development, she suffered 2 periods of intense dietary stress. So it looks like she and her kind were under dietary stress, and maybe that was one of the things that drove us to become more terrestrial, looking for resources as the forest started to break up in periods of desiccation. Now, over the millions of years that animals like her lived, there would have been periods of wet as well as periods of dry. We have another skeleton, which is essentially, as far as we're concerned, probably a male of the same species as her, but much younger, dating from maybe 2.4 million years, something like that. So that he can tell us a little bit, but he may have been living in a wetter environment. Things between the two of them, periods of the two of them lived, there was fluctuation in between wet and dry, as I've said. It wasn't always one way, but over time it became one way. But there was fluctuation. But ultimately, as millennia and millions of years passed, it became increasingly desiccated and did not recover to full tropical rainforest status. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Let me just ask you another thing, because when talking about the evolution of our bipedality, some people put some hypotheses on the table, like, for example, that we started walking upright because when we lived in the savannah, it would have been helpful for us to detect incoming predators, for example, and other people also refer the fact that we would be able to free our hands to carry objects like food, tools, and other things like that. So does any of those hypotheses hold any water or not?
Yes, you picked an odd phrase there, hold any water. I was just wondering whether you were going to talk about the aquatic hypothesis. That was once suggested, and and some people are still very keen about it, that we became bipedal because of us wading around in water. No, that's not it's not an idea which most people these days take seriously. But yes, there are advantages to becoming increasingly bipedal. Let's put it that way. If you can spot predators from a distance, yes. Carrying, I think, is perhaps more to the point. Because of her body proportions, and again, you can do this, and we have done this using computer simulations. Your body proportions tell you a lot about what you can do, and without losing efficiency when you walk. Now, curiously, we human beings are optimally adapted for carrying loads of about 1 kilogram or 1.1 kilogram in the hand. And what's that the size of? It's the size of an Acheulean hand axe, roughly. So yes, hand carrying is probably very important in our own the evolution of our own genus. So carrying things. She would not have been so good at carrying things. Chimpanzees are completely useless at carrying things. Although chimpanzees can use tools, can use stone tools, and in rare cases can make stone tools, it's interesting that there is data about some sites, some forest sites, where chimpanzees use tools to crack nuts. Those nuts are not, and the remains of them, the remains of the tools, are never found very far away from each other. They, because of their chimpanzees' optimization for fast quadrupedalism, they are useless at carrying anything at all. The first thing that probably improved in terms of carrying was carrying over the shoulder. But as that is less demanding than having things in the hand, because obviously that's a matter of fine tuning and arm swing. When we walk long distances, our arms swing like this to back, which essentially balances. When one leg swings forward, the other arm swings in the opposite direction. Okay, so that's really finely timed and tuned, and it was actually quite difficult to get right. Now we can get it right. We've been doing it for a very long time, and we can get it right with small loads carried in the hand. But probably early human ancestors and probably early Homo could not. So yes, there is some truth in that, but I think it happens later in our evolution. And again, yes, standing up and seeing predators would be important, of course. You can see longer distances if you're already in the savannah. Littlefoot would not have gone very far into the savannah, and human ancestors of that period would not have gone very far. They would not be safe because they walk very slowly. So they would not have gone very far into the savannah, although there was savannah there. So they go out a little bit out into the grassland and then back into the trees again, where they feel safer. But during
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, isn't it also the case that changes that occur to the pelvis, as the ones you mentioned earlier, also turned childbirth more difficult for women?
Yes, that's another major pressure, and that the evolution of the obstetric pelvis, the childbearing pelvis, is another major factor we have to take into consideration. And myself, I don't think we are far enough along with that. But yes, we have large brains. Having large brains does make childbirth very difficult. It's interesting that maybe that's one of the reasons why she has a small brain, because it's easier to get a large skull out of the pelvis. If you have a large brained animal, it's more difficult to get the skull out of the pelvis. So the bigger your brain gets, the more problems you've got. So yes, I wouldn't claim to understand the complex dynamics between the evolution of a pelvis which is good for being a biped and the evolution of pelvis which is good for childbirth. There is a balance that had to be achieved. It's not fully understood by a very long chalk.
Right. And can you tell us anything about the relationship between the way our musculoskeletal system is organized and the fact that we can, for example, run longer distances than other animals without getting tired?
Yes, it's not entirely tired. This is not my speciality, but I can certainly say some things about it.
Sure.
In terms of tiredness, that it relates to the sole of our feet. The sole of our feet has a strong spring in it. That spring can be loaded when we're standing upright, and that the energy is then returned as we take off.
Right.
And that is one of the things which drives endurance walking and endurance running in particular. So we don't run the same way as we walk. We don't much use our springs when we walk. We do use them when we run. Now, the other thing we're good at is actually dealing with irregular terrain. Now, if you have a race over several days between a horse and a human, and if you have a race between a horse and a human for a couple of hours, well, I think everyone knows what the answer for a couple of hours or 1 hour is. We're absolutely bloody useless. If you have a race over several days over irregular terrain, over hills, over even in the Sahara, we win, not the horse, because the horse is so fine-tuned with its own so much more complicated springs. It's finely tuned for very efficient walking, that it can't really deal with differences in terrain. So courses for horses actually flat. Courses for humans can be very irregular, and that's actually been shown in Sahara and actually in my own country, Wales, where that people have raced between humans and horses, and over a short distance, horses always win. Over several days, it's the humans that win because the structure of our feet, the complexity of our feet, where we have a lot of bones and ligaments and these very efficient springs. This enables us not only to be efficient to a certain extent, but to be very able to tolerate ground irregularity. And I don't know what the term in what you'd say in Portugal, but when you have a race, horse racing, it's on the television. They're always talking about what they call the going.
I'm not sure.
The going is hard. It affects, and that is the texture of the ground. We call it the going, and that's because some horses are better at hard going than other horses. So it's one of the things which affects which horse is going to win. So because of the way that horses are arranged, they are not very good at irregular terrain. We are. And it's having complex multi-segment feet which helps with that. Does that help answer that question?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I have just one last question, I think. So by studying the evolution of our locomotion and how our musculoskeletal system evolved and the kinds of functions, let's say, it evolved to fulfill, can we understand better with our modern habits, modern sedentary habits, let's say, can we understand better how our musculoskeletal diseases develop?
To some extent, but not as much of an extent as I personally would like. Because we don't optimize certain areas. In evolution, it's good enough if you can live to breeding age, breed some kids, and then you can conveniently die. Now, the human back, for example, is rubbish. If I was designing a human back, I wouldn't design a lower back. I wouldn't design it like ours. But it was just good enough. And that's how evolution works, on a just good enough basis. I mean, I'm probably going to have to get up and I know about this in horrible detail because I've got I have very bad low back problems, um, and I'm about to go to hospital next week for more, hopefully for more surgery. So it can help us with, to some extent. It can tell us more, for example, in relation to other joints which are more optimized, like, for example, the knee joint. Um, Knowing about how the foot works in humans, of course, should help us with one thing, which is design of shoes, but doesn't. Because people go for pretty shoes. They don't go for shoes which are designed for people who don't wear shoes. And that is, of course, what we've evolved for to do, is not wear shoes.
Right.
We, our feet evolved barefoot. They didn't evolve wearing shoes. And so we have, we all of us have in the West have pathological feet. And knowing more about what our feet have evolved to do, and what should certainly help us design better shoes. And I hope that somebody out there listening will do something about that, because we're crippling all our children by the silly shoes we put them in.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Crompton, just before we go, would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Um, well, I don't tend to put my work a lot on the internet. What you should look out for very soon, we are just about to release a whole special volume of the Journal of Human Evolution about this lady, and that we are going to have quite a bit of, hopefully, a publicity about that, which should be accessible to everybody. We hope so. It's I really don't, because I don't really do internet stuff very much myself. There is one problem with internet is who you end up talking to, and I made some rather scary internet acquaintances, both in the fundamentalist Christian world and in the fundamentalist Muslim world, which have rather put me off being on the internet. One of them, the fundamentalist ones, who is now safely in jail. He was finally caught playing around with some young ladies he shouldn't have been playing around with. But so I'm glad he's gone to jail. But there are a lot of fundamentalist Christians who I wouldn't like to meet on as well. So yes, we are going to be putting out quite a bit of information. Littlefoot has been talked about on the BBC site. The BBC's sites are generally pretty good. So there are some television programs. I've done some television programs for the BBC, and we hope the BBC will give us some more coverage. So in the first case, look out in the next few weeks, very soon actually, for hearing more about Littlefoot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And Dr. Crompton, thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
And thank you for taking the time to talk to me. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. So it is thanks to people like you that the show has been running for such a long time, more than 3 years now. And I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, hit the subscription button, and comment on it. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karin Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whitting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Bosbo, Weingart, Becker, Neuberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Ala Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Ellman, my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.